welcome to the Researching the Future, What's Next for the People Who Can Save the World conference. I'm Tim Winkler from Twig Marketing, and we're bringing this conference to you in conjunction with Stephen Matchett, publisher of Campus Morning Mail, and looking at the key issues for Australian university researchers right now. This session is going to be fascinating. Research commercialisation. Have we got the model? Have we got the solution to the funding issues of the research sector for the future right here in commercialisation? There's been a groundswell of pressure on research commercialisation over the last few years as a new avenue, and sometimes the great hope for research funding growth. But we need to take a bit of a deeper look at the complexities of how it can work, and of course the many pitfalls along the way to make sure that we don't waste money and we end up producing some positive outcomes for the sector. I'm really delighted to welcome AJ George, Dr. Amanda Jane George, Senior Lecturer at CQU, who's had a long experience in a range of roles in this space. Tony Peacock, Chairman of Wintermute Biomedical, who's will be known to many people in the sector after I think at least 25 years working in CRCs and many other areas, and Luke Shee, who will also be well known to the sector, the Executive Director of the ATN. Welcome to all of you.
G'day.
Thanks, Tim.
Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Yorta Yorta people, and would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all live and work, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're recording this session, and the recording link will be made available afterwards. If you've got questions, please submit them through the Q&A area. Now, Luke, why don't we start with you? Have we got the right model now? And if not, what are the first 2 or 3 things that you would love to see change to make life easier in terms of commercialising research?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tim, and thank you for inviting me along, and thank you to Stephen and Campus Morning Mail as well, of course. Can I acknowledge I'm on lands of the East Kulin Nation and the Wurundjeri people here in what we know as Melbourne at RMIT. So look, this is a really timely conversation, and it's something that, of course, as these ATN universities, 6 universities with, a long tradition of working with industry and working with individuals, frankly, as well, to give them the opportunity to work in jobs in industry. There's lots of things we can do, but I wanted to start really by acknowledging that while we've had a change of government and we welcome, the positive engagement we've had already with the Albanese government and Minister Clare and Minister Husick and others in their new portfolios, I wanted to acknowledge some of the good work that's actually was done by the previous government, and particularly in research commercialisation. Trailblazer universities, obviously something we're very strongly supportive of, and the ATN can probably boast that we are involved directly, if not leading 4 out of the 6 successful bids. So we're very pleased with that outcome. And Australia's Economic Accelerator policy just before the last budget and before the election is also a great investment, $1.6 billion, and then stretch that out to $2.2 billion as a total package. We know there's bipartisan support for that, but we know in difficult times, particularly fiscal consolidation times like we're going to experience in the next couple of years ahead, those investments are really important, but they're also hard to win and hard to hold on to. So I want to acknowledge that environment, that policy development has been really successful. And I acknowledge that Minister Tudge and Minister Tehan and of course, Acting Minister Stuart Robert were passionate about that. And of course, that was extended to Tanya Plibersek in her role as Shadow Minister. That's good policy, but we don't want to ruin it by not having all the foundational parts as well. But I think it is also really important for our sector sometimes to acknowledge good policy work from the Commonwealth. I think it's also important that we, work in tandem or work in collaboration with industry. And I've always had a bit of a mantra, Tim, that if universities wait for the government to act, sometimes it's a bit too slow. So that's why we've across the ATN. And to think of examples like Curtin University with, who have literally, dozens of industries at their campus working, on a number of issues. I think about Carbon Futures and the startup businesses that are down in Warren Ponds at Deakin Geelong. And I also think about the nearly 400 and something startup and micro businesses that we see at the Ultimo startup site at UTS. Our universities are already, using 300,000 odd students as our future entrepreneurs. So we're kind of already doing this, and it's really fantastic when government comes along for the journey, right? Comes along for the ride and endorses what we do. No university representative like me is going to have come to this conversation, though, Tim, and not want to talk about the fact that we need to have a solid foundation for research translation. We can't commercialize research until that research is discovered. And frankly, that means we need to make sure that we have a good, solid pipeline of discovery or basic research at our universities. And there is a hole. There's been a policy hole left in that with changes to the way we fund universities over the last 3 years. I won't bore everyone by going into really policy wonk details. But what I will say is that it's fundamentally important that we have the ability to do the technology, that technology readiness level exchange at the closest to market end can't occur unless we do the stuff at the lower end. And for those of you who don't know the technology readiness level, I encourage you to talk to any one of our vice chancellors or my great friend who's now gone to UNSW, Attila Brungs. But really what we're saying is you've got to have the bits of the research that we don't know, so we know what we then do know, so then we can commercialise it and gift it, frankly, to our economy and to our society, and that can then in turn create jobs. I wanted to have one quick shout out as well about state governments. I think in the last decade or so, we've seen terrific acceleration of state government's contribution to the innovation ecosystem in Australia and the use of universities as part of their strategic economic development and industry development. And that's really, accelerated. We saw nearly $1 billion in the New South Wales state budget only a couple of weeks ago for science and technology. And of course, more than $2 billion in Breakthrough Victoria here in my home state is unbelievable. So there really has been an acceleration of state governments in this general policy space, and we welcome that. So there are a couple of my thoughts. I'm sure some of my more learned colleagues on this panel could make an even more valuable contribution. But from our point of view, it's an exciting time to be in this space. We want to make sure we get all of the policy settings right so we can continue this journey.
Thanks very much, Luke. Before we just move on, you mentioned bipartisan support. Is there a danger that governments of all persuasions, state, federal, and all colours of government, that they will rely on commercialisation to fill the funding gap that they don't want to pay for? That they're basically saying, we'll give you a little sweetener, go and turn that into multiple billions of dollars, and then we don't have to actually fund that lower end of the technology readiness level area that you were talking about.
Well, we have to continue to, make sure that policymakers, be it from department officials through to ministers, and prime ministers and premiers, fundamentally understand that it's a whole ecosystem. And there's that, what we described in a submission to the Trailblazer and other research commercialisation process that Jeff Connolly so wonderfully led for the federal government. That technology and technology transfer sweet spot, needs to occur within that ecosystem. So we have to make sure that we continue to better educate our policymakers in that process, right? So that's the first thing. I think the other thing as well, it's really exciting, and take Trailblazer as an example. I mean, really fundamentally transforming what some of our universities do. So it is really shifting a lot of the investment and the investment signalling to that research commercialisation sweet spot. And that's a good thing. I mean, of course, universities like the Australian Technology Network of Universities have always been, we pride ourselves in the applied research part that we do. But you're absolutely right, Tim, there is a risk that all eggs in one basket can lead to a distortion in what governments think they have to do. So my core message is great work so far, but let's not throw out the great work by not putting the foundational investments in as well. But one thing as well that's terribly exciting is that the number of in the Trailblazer process alone, governments put some investment in, send a wonderful signal. Then they were asking for co-investment from universities, from both cash and in-kind support, but also from businesses. And what we're seeing is, upwards of, hundreds of millions of dollars on the table from businesses, including SMEs. And that's terribly exciting. So yes, there is a risk that governments might kind of think, oh, job done, let's move to this space and let the private sector do its job, which isn't a bad thing. But it is also worth acknowledging how much of a pipeline of potential funding we have. And if you think back to the start of COVID, that wasn't the case. We were quite worried about the ability for particularly SMEs to access capital. So, there's been a significant turnaround in the last couple of years, and we're really excited about that. How do we bank that and cultivate that and continue is also equally as important, I'd say, as ensuring that we have governments investing in the whole part of that ecosystem, including that discovery research.
I might jump in then, Tim. I'm less optimistic about the Trailblazers, and I'll wait and see a bit. I don't know why we need new, what's the next step in Trailblazers? Are they going to have rounds of them or whatever? As I think it's just a bit of a brain fart, to be honest. That I lead an industry group in food, and we looked to get involved, and the price tag was $2 million to even be part of the syndicate before we knew what research would be done. To ask industry to put $2 million a year up to fund a university program for 5 years, $10 million commitment is ludicrous in my view, and so we didn't go in. And I just find, why don't they discuss these things a bit more? I won't harp back to the CRC program, but they're $50 million slabs of money as well, but industry led there, and it's a proven model that's envied around the world. So I hope the Trailblazers work, but I don't see the point of one-off programs, to be honest. I just think that's bad policy. If you're not going to commit to it for a good 10 years, why fund 6 one-off things that may or may not work? That you shouldn't be looking to industry and commercialisation I really don't like the term third stream funding. If academics and universities are just looking to industry as another funding source, it's doomed to fail. I think, unless they're looking at it as a partnering thing. It's a while now since I did a Churchill Fellowship in looking at these systems around the world, and I visited the universities with the highest income from industry. So New York University pays for about 1/3 of all its research from licenses, so about a $600 million research budget, 200 million coming in licensing. That's the most in the world, far higher than Cornell or Stanford. Stanford's about, it's lost in the rounding up, the commercialisation money that comes into that university compared with donations and their other income. And so any government that thinks they're going to pay for education through research commercialisation is just straight out wrong. It's not going to happen. Companies don't run on, they don't fund research universities as venture funds. They're not venture funds, they're education institutes and research. And so I think the value of commercialisation to a university is the engagement that they get out of it and the relevance they get out of it for their teaching and for the excellence of their research. It validates the excellence of their research. And so I think it's really important that we don't give them, the policy makers, any sort of view that they're going to be able to get out of funding public research that way. I know we've had it when it was formerly, you know, a third of the cost of CSIRO through commercial research. It made them incredibly mercenary. Leads to incredibly distorted behaviours from people going after research, competing with each other, undercutting, all sorts of really terrible behaviour, I think. And it all becomes about the dollars instead of about the outcomes. The dollars are just a means to the end. So that's an opening from me, Tim. Sorry to be negative. Sorry, Luke, but. And I hope I'm wrong, and I hope Luke's right.
Great to have a diversity of views. Just before we go to AJ, Tony, you said the value of the two universities is engagement, relevance, validates their excellence in research. What's the value to industry?
Oh, getting access to good people and good research. We're not there to sponsor it. And so just to carry on that, right, I added up this morning, I've got in Wintermute, which is one of the companies I chair, we've got Wintermute Biomedical and Wintermute Biomedical Australia, two companies, one in the US, one here. And we've got current research contracts with the State University of New York, the University of Minnesota, RMIT University and Murdoch University. And it is incredibly noticeable how much easier it is to do a contract with the two American universities. The RMIT University one came through this morning, and they're claiming all my IP, 100% of it. And when I go back with a fundamental, you know, that's not going to work, and I thought we understood that's not going to work. You know, you get a bounce back. Sorry, the research office is so understaffed, we can't respond to you. So you can literally do a deal with University of Minnesota. It probably took 3 days. So I think there's a really fundamental problem with our research contracts officers. In all cases, obviously, we're working with people that we think are brilliant researchers in all cases. But in the two American ones, they've got their research contracts officers really supporting the researchers and acting quick and understanding your IP and your needs. Whereas in the Australian cases, they're still in gatekeeper mode and they're in charge of the process. And you've got to put the researchers into the driving seat somehow. And that's, you know, that's two universities where I'm literally mates with the DVCRs, and you end up sort of, oh God, have I got to ring somebody? And, you know, as you said, I've been around this game for so bloody long. People think I'm a permanent fixture. I'm a gargoyle at Sydney Uni or something. And I know everyone. Well, how does an SME that's just starting up do it if they run into those roadblocks? They're just not going to do it. They just walk away. And we gave up. We had a fantastic lab over at La Trobe University, but we decided we would just contract our research. And I've got to say, La Trobe were fantastic. All our universities are fantastic research-wise, great labs, really good people. And the researchers understand what's going to be done, but they don't expect to suddenly own all our IP. But it happens every time that these are universities that say they understand these things, but when you get the contract, and I got one overnight, because we will own everything. And, you know, and it's even worse. At least that's a very short contract. I have had that happen to me, and Lisa Watts from the conversation can clarify this, because we were research partners on a linkage grant, and I won't name the university, but it was I think it was a 257-page contract, and they claimed to own the IP on page 80 of that contract. Now, I went back to that university and said, you know, it's a big deal for an SME to send a 257-page contract to our printer, let alone to our lawyers. It's a big deal. And working with SMEs and not putting a note on the front of it to say, by the way, we're claiming all the IP and you better look at page 80. You know, you've got to find workable solutions that are, you know, contracts that are easy. So I would say, in terms of have we got the model right, we're vastly better than we used to be, but we've still got some fundamental problems at the. I think there's a lot of churn in those offices. They don't. You absolutely agree with the Vice Chancellor and DVCR, and the researchers are great, but there's still a missed step there. I'll stop because the two blokes have just talked and talked and talked.
Well, it's the perfect segue to you, AJ. With your experience in contracts and working in this space for the more than 2 decades, you're perfectly positioned to tell us, have we improved, and how are those contracts going?
Well, yeah, it's been an interesting journey. I'm not sure that things have improved significantly. I don't want to throw any shade in Luke's direction, but yeah, I certainly think there is at least a greater willingness to discuss the need for improvement, and on a bipartisan level also, I think the policy wants are coming around to the idea that this really needs to have cross-party support in order to really gain traction. One of my studies a couple of years ago looked at, from the stakeholders' point of view, what they wanted to see in terms of improving the collaboration ecosystem. And unfortunately, there was a real indicator of malaise in terms of not seeing credible policies emerging that really seem to meet the needs of the stakeholders, and not seeing that bipartisan effort that they really wanted to see in terms of making the environment, improving the environment for stakeholders to be able to collaborate better. It's interesting that Tony should mention contracts. That's my little patch there, and anywhere up to more than a third of stakeholders that we've surveyed have encountered that walk away issue, because the whole contracting process just got too complex for what it was. It was just overwrought. Negotiations were going on for too long. Timelines were being missed. Opportunities were being missed. And don't forget, there's an opportunity cost in negotiating a contract with one particular party anyway, because you're not negotiating with others. So there's a whole stack of issues around that that really do exacerbate the problems at the front end in terms of finding that connection with the right collaboration partner. As Tony mentioned as well, you've got, particularly for SMEs that don't have mates at universities, trying to just enter the university gate and find the right people to talk to is a challenge, let alone actually sit around the negotiation table and hammer out the finer niceties of who's going to own IP. So it really is, it's a 360-degree issue right from front end to back end. And, it's not something, and here's where I agree with Tony, it's not something that you can fix with just a few ad hoc initiatives, like, for example, Trailblazer or expanding the CSIRO on program, looking at expanding the CSIRO main sequence bench. There's a few things that have come out recently that are kind of touted as, landmark developments. I think picking up on what Luke said about, it's great to see that there are some well-funded initiatives to encourage collaboration, like the Trailblazer program, but there is also the need to kind of be all things to all men, which is, don't forget basic research. The scientists don't want to be forgotten in that department. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that there is a whole lot of moving parts here. And what is really badly needed to rob Luke's words, is a great foundation. And in order to have a great foundation, you know, we really need to be sitting down, taking our time and thinking through all of the moving parts so that we can try and stitch together some initiatives that actually stand a long-term prospect of success. I mean, bear in mind, a couple of years ago, we couldn't even agree on the innovation metrics that were applicable for Australia. We still haven't got the innovation metrics report, and that would be a nice, I don't think that's going to happen. But what we really do need is sitting down around, you know, the table and hammering out in a bipartisan fashion what needs to happen moving forward. I think that's the most important thing. And the heartening thing, I guess, to end on a positive note, is what I'm hearing from both the Clare and Houston camps is that they're here to listen. They're here to forge a way ahead, hopefully that actually will gain some traction. So call me an eternal optimist, but I think we can, you know, see some change moving forward.
Can I just follow up on that, AJ, particularly in relation to contracts? Why is it that we, you know, try and claim 100% of IP when others might not? Is there something culturally astray in how we try and hold things because we're worried about past failures or letting things, you know, missed opportunities in the past, or because we're an island nation with an inferiority complex? Who knows? There's a whole range of reasons, but do you think there's a cultural issue around our approach to contracts?
I think there's a couple of issues that feed into the contract/IP conundrum. I guess that's the best word for it. One of them, I'll pick up on what Tony said, and that is the funding squeeze on universities. There is a real drive to squeeze every dollar that universities can out of whatever innovation goodies that they can see in their scientific closets. So there is always that drive there to, I will say, perhaps take a harder position to the table than might be warranted. There is that fear factor. I will agree, Tim, that universities are worried about their reputational benefits. There's with this whole patent box issue that came up last year, you know, patents are starting to be touted as, you know, the gold star for university work in the area, and should be collected like little, you know, frequent flyer points. Unfortunately, you know, patents are an important first step in terms of commercialising, but the reality is that most patented innovations aren't fabulous money makers of the likes of Gardasil. Most patented inventions, you know, even where they're commercialised, will bring a modest return. So I think there needs to be some realism attached to, you know, exactly what IP does and can do for the university sector. And that, I guess, segues into the other issue that really feeds into this contracting problem, which is a lack of IP literacy. People just don't know what IP is and how it can be most effectively used. Oftentimes, as Tony said, you know, look, where you're an SME, the last thing you want to do is hand over your valuable IP, or particularly IP that's going to form the cornerstone of your business moving forward. The last thing that you want to do is be giving it away and then be worried about the university's capacity to actually get the thing out to market and do what it's meant to do. So yeah, there is a real need for greater IP literacy amongst, you know, university researchers, and that's something that I've kind of been on a crusade for the last 20 odd years.
Can I jump in there, Tim? Because IP, it's been a part of that more controversial part of the recommendations, right, out of the previous governments. And this kind of move towards potentially a prescriptive one-size-fits-all approach to IP is something we were pretty critical of as an ATN, and I'm sure AJ and Tony will fundamentally agree with me on that. One thing ATN's tried to do, which has been quite bold, and it's about 6 or 7 years ago now, so it was when we had a previous kind of version of our membership, but we launched an IP principles framework for all of the ATN. Now, while it didn't agree on policies, it certainly was trying to send a signal, particularly to SMEs, that we had a consistent approach from across the then 5 ATNs. We're now 6 and 2 minus 1, so it's a different membership, and we'll seek to relaunch those principles in a contemporary context. But it is something that we need to not, I think we need to get much better at articulating what IP is all about, the principle approach, reassuring the industry partners around, what our approach will be, and give them some, certainty. And that's why I think across many universities, and where you see these collaborative projects or consortium bids, it's actually quite a good thing. So we're very proud of those IP principles, and and of course they shouldn't be static. They should evolve like any good document. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing I wanted to say, and Tony, you gave the most salient point. I mean, I've been in this game a long time, and I talked about state governments, right? I mean, we've seen experiences of tiny grants available from governments or from universities for that matter, with hundreds and hundreds of pages of compliance attached to it, and almost exhaust the value of the grant in the first 10 minutes, because you think, here is $50,000 worth of legal advice that I have to get in order to get a $50,000 grant. So we have to streamline these processes, right? I mean, there are so many component parts. And then just finally, I think, combined with IP and approaches to funding and co-funding, you're absolutely right. We can't have one program does not make a reform. What we are talking about more broadly is encouraging an ecosystem, and encouraging an ecosystem is looking at all the component parts. And it's why, AJ, I'm sure you've got, years of experience in the legal side of how to do it, right? In terms of, how to ensure that, a smaller party with a large party, or perhaps a third party in terms of government, can collaborate in a really easy way. One thing I think universities need to do, and is we need to do our part in opening the doors to collaboration better. And I think over the last 10, 15 years, I've seen the rise of better collaboration. Many years ago, when I worked at Swinburne University, not an ATN member, but very ATN-like here in Victoria, I was in a group of universities across Victoria where we looked at research collaboration fronts. I think that collaborative piece, both nationally and at a state level, around kit, around approaches to IP, around, approaches to and coming from years of CRC collaboration, Tony, right? I mean, this is where all of this has really kind of been born out of the, of the Hawke government program of the CRC, which still is alive and strong. But, we need to get better at ourselves, bringing ourselves to this innovation and commercialisation story. And while we do that, then articulate the need for the investment in the ecosystem, because our job we'll never be able to do the things that we want to do compared to like-minded jurisdictions who are investing at a rate, unheard of in Australia, in a global innovation system, if we don't have that ecosystem approach. So I think there's a few lessons for us as well as a sector to come, particularly universities, to come with them, openly, and that's the approach that we've tried to take in the past of the ATN, and will continue to do, and I'm sure our colleagues in other universities will as well.
Luke, I'm really, as a follow-up question, do you think that we need to have, maybe something like a network-based approach to this rather than an individual university-based approach? Obviously, there's going to be a mix in amongst there, but anyone who's dealt with a university before or a number of universities knows that there's highly variable skill sets and capabilities as you go university to university. So given that there are some weaknesses clearly in some universities, do we need more of a one-stop shop approach? Go to the ATN, they'll solve your commercialisation problem.
Yeah. Oh, look, it'll come as no surprise to anyone listening or later who listens to the recording that I'm a fan of university networks, right? And I'm very much a fan of an expanding university network, which we have expanded our membership by 50% in the last couple of years. So in short, like-minded universities should come together and share practice, but we do have very different communities in which we serve as well. I mean, we now have 2 regional universities in the ATN, and we have universities, in Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. There are different industries and different emerging industry priorities for those jurisdictions. So there is value in networks. There's also value in collaboration at the state level. And I don't want to dismiss or diminish any of the excellent work that's occurred then. And one thing I think has been really great practice as well, which is emerging and going with full strength, is precinct approaches. Aerotropolis is one that comes to mind in New South Wales around the Western Sydney airport development. We've got the Fisherman's Bend here in Victoria, the Torrens project site, sorry, not the Torrens site, the former car manufacturing site in South Australia. So, there's so many ways that networks can play a role. So I don't want to just say it's national peak bodies, but yes, you're absolutely right. I think sharing of kit, Victoria's approach to synchrotron, had a rocky start. I think with all of these things as well, we're looking at 10, 15 year, 20 year proof of concept sometimes, right? So I think, when we start a journey, we're not going to absolutely end where we started. So I think there's a lot of value in that. And that's why I really do acknowledge the role of state governments, because they're really upping their game in acknowledging and working and bringing their funding checkbook, so to speak, to these big challenges that they have in their areas. And mRNA is one example. Where we're seeing a bit of a Victoria, New South Wales race to get the investments right on that front. But back to your question, networks I think are really important in terms of driving national reform and getting good ideas and banking them, right? And we've certainly done that in things like IP. We've done it with approaches to CRCs. We've done it in other areas. And I think it's good to have the collective voice being heard in policy development. But the front door thing, we've tried that before at the ATN, and we've been successful in it with the Industry Doctoral Training Centre, which we had for a number of years, we were delighted to get funding from the Minister then, Kim Carr, so it's a long time ago now. But it's so successful in the end, it could just be given back to the universities because they'd already had their matured, established links anyway. So sometimes we do approaches at a collective level, and then sometimes they run their course as well. So I think there's a multitude of ways to get where we want to go. The best thing to do though is not have a race for always competing for piles of money as being the only way to succeed in this innovation ecosystem. We need to do lots more ground policy work collectively as a sector to get all of those component parts right.
Tony, I saw your hand up there.
One of the ones I like to point out, and I know some of the Australian universities are trying it. I loved when I did that study. Wake Forest University had a person called the concierge to the university. I think that was on their business card. So there's no wrong door to go through, and I think that's really important. We're still not very good at that. If a company wants to find some expertise, and I know there's been lots of ways of assisting and trying to help and matching programs, but nothing's really stuck particularly well. So for SMEs, or even big companies, it's hard to find the academics. I'm on the land of the Ghana people in Uni SA today, but just in this one city, there's 3 universities. It's hard to find who can deliver for you. And we still need to do better at that. There's a system in the States now, and I think anyone can use it. The Europeans are using it, called Halo Science, where companies can post their problems for academics to respond to. You know, some of those, we do more matching sites and things like that to smooth the process, and anything that we can do that then once you do find a good researcher and the people you want to work with, that smooths the way to working with them. So I think there is a mismatch that Australia's got. You know, we're way out of where we should be in the league in terms of the excellence of our universities and our student offering. You know, we're quite extraordinary for a country this size. But if we could equal that in the commercialisation and working with companies, and a lot of the time I am just talking about contracting type work, but that's the start of bigger things. As you gain confidence with working with that university and those researchers, then you're more likely to sponsor rather than just contract specific jobs. You need to be able to build that up over time. And I think simple things like actually finding the right people and having the right systems in place would go a long way. I know when I talk to vice chancellors, they say, oh, we think we've fixed that. You know, we've got those things. But I think if you really talk to companies, they still are quite nervous about whether they're finding the right people, whether it's going to get done in a timely manner. You know, the level of delivery, stuff like that is still an issue.
It's been an issue since the Ecola review in 2015. I mean, that was one of the things that came out of that review, just how opaque the university system is for most SMEs. And that whole, as Luke was calling it, that front door issue is a real problem. And that's why I think, you know, with all of these moving parts, one of the things that came out of this recent round of reforms in terms of the standardised contracts, I don't think that you can look at an initiative like that and say that's going to drive collaboration up, because to even get around the negotiation table, you've got to have the relationship, and if you can't find the other party in the first place, you know, I just find that there's a real disconnect between you know, the rationale behind the standardised contracts and driving up the collaborative performance of the country. I mean, I think that you've got to look far more broadly than just you know, a stack of half a dozen initiatives, including standardised contracts. I think it's, like I said, you've got to look at all the moving parts. And one thing I did want to pick up on, something that Tony said before, which was that feeling from stakeholders that in the past, there has been a rush to get things done politically. There's, you know, that sense of expediency that we just need to have the policies on the table now. You know, now is the time. But that does often leave stakeholders feeling left behind in the process, particularly the ones that are not at the big end of town. And I think, you know, to get the foundations of what we need to address all of the moving parts, we really have to. And this is why I said I was quite heartened from what I was hearing from the camps at this point, is the willingness to sit down and really listen to the stakeholders. While I'm on that point, I might, as a researcher myself, reiterate the importance of, you know, just reviewing and evaluating what's gone right and what's gone wrong in the past. I think that's super important for working out where to head to in the future, so we don't end up in this closed loop process where we're just chasing our own tail, as we have been for the better part of a couple of decades. We want to try and break that mould and start a really different perspective. And I would applaud Luke's use of the word ecosystem, because we really have to get away from this pipeline view of, you know, a pattern that magically then finds its way through the pipeline out to a prosperous market outcome. You've got to be looking much more broadly at the ecosystem. And I think if we can head towards that direction, that would be a real bonus.
So AJ, do you think that means that a government-led response is the solution we need, that the university sector itself is not going to just solve this problem on its own?
I think it would be disingenuous to suggest that the government is not going to be the invisible hand behind what universities do. My study certainly shows that universities are extremely responsive to levers that get pulled. Most obviously funding. It worked with the ERA rounds in terms of excellence, and now in terms of commercialisation, we are seeing a different set of levers pulled. And I think this is where a lot of the university sector gets a bit uncomfortable, because we haven't had this targeted approach for many, many years. Obviously, the most famous targeted set of approaches was the Hawke era, industry restructuring, where we did have a suite of very targeted initiatives, but that was in the context of industry, fairly heavy industry restructure. And then we went through this really long phase of free market initiatives that basically said, hands off, any initiatives that we do have to be applied across the board. We're not going to try and pick winners. In fact, picking winners was really seen as anathema to the policy views at the time. And I think that now there is a growing recognition that if Australia is to consolidate its strengths, particularly in the tech areas moving forward, the digital workforce is going to demand that if we're going to be successful in those kinds of areas, then we need to at least have some targeted initiatives. And that's where I think there has been this growing discomfort with these new initiatives that are very industry focused and targeting specific industries. It's just because it's a different type of policy making that we're not used to for the past 20 odd years.
Luke, what's your thoughts in terms of the government's role from here? Imagine you're in the hot seat, or well, you are in the hot seat, but imagine you've got the minister's ear, and you say, well, you've got to remember 3 things to get commercialisation right over the next year. This is what you've got to start to do.
Yeah, okay. Look, I'm trying not to be the eternal optimist on this panel, but you just have to sometimes find the role. But there are a couple, I think 3 things really speak to what Amanda just said. AJ, I was very excited about all of those things you were saying before. You get that kind of that moment in a dinner party where everyone's just talking, and I was thinking, oh my God, there's so many, but let me start with a few that are related to what you just said. One is the ecosystem starts with cultivating the next entrepreneurs and SME developers, right? So let's take our students as entrepreneurs and let's bank that. We already have the largest startup and micro businesses on one site in New South Wales at UTS Startups. So we're already starting as universities by doing that. And that is only going to improve if we get policies like the startup year that the Labor Party put on the table. Fun fact for the historians out there, put it on the table in the 2016 campaign, but also the 2022 election. And we're really excited about playing and shaping our role in that, because it's giving the entrepreneurs of the future an additional year at university to work with university experts. And on that, one of the really important things about SMEs is it's not just collaboration on R&D or kit or use of kit or rapidly prototyping. It's actually it's often skills, mentoring, how to navigate legal arrangements, how to fill skills gaps without a lot of money in an SME. And we do that as well. That knowledge exchange and knowledge between the university and the SME is really important. So first point, really broad, is students, let's start the entrepreneurial culture here, right? We haven't been as successful as North America on this, and we should be. We've got talented students, both international and national. Second big point, and AJ said this so eloquently, industry policy. Industry policy, industry policy, industry policy. You absolutely need to end the era of the laissez-faire. We've goaded the car industry out of Australia. We can't replace it with the mass employment industries in that type of manufacturing anymore. Absolutely fantastic to see, you know, those Tonsley was the site from South Australia before that's been retrofitted. You know, you're seeing advanced manufacturing, medical manufacturing here in Victoria replace, you know, go into old automobile component parts. That's fantastic, but we need more. Our competitor countries do pick winners, and they do, and that is about, you know, ensuring that we've got certainty. Now, there was the discussion around the manufacturing priorities from the last government. That's fine. I'd like to see something that also brings in humanities and social science lens about understanding rapid changes in our society, health, the caring economy. Those things are priorities. And the third thing is absolutely the workforce that's required. And, you know, ATN universities are working as anchor partners with the Technology Council on the ambition to lift Australia's overall tech workforce to 1.2, 1.3 million in this decade. That is fundamental, but that's one of the issues, right? So we have to ensure that we've got the teaching and learning component or the skills component of our economy absolutely turbocharged, with the innovation ecosystem turbocharged as well. And I think so it's the students as entrepreneurs are starting that you know, turbocharging the ecosystem from the beginning. Industry policy clarity, so we can invest, and, you know, and then of course the skills that we need for a sophisticated economy. And, you know, wouldn't it be wonderful if over the next period ahead with the new government, we got some much clearer partnership with government in terms of their policy signalling, but also their willingness to listen comes with our willingness as a sector to listen to their priorities and come together. For a long time, I think sometimes we operate too separately. The corporate world operates separately from the university world, operates separately from state and federal government priorities. Let's come together and do some interesting things, acknowledging that we've got differences across our great continent, but we have many, many shared challenges and many shared industries that we can achieve greatness together. So I think they're the things that I would be taking. As a recovered ministerial advisor, I don't think I have to do those anymore, but I would lend those ideas to the future ministerial advisors in Canberra, and of course in Spring Street, Macquarie Street, and Victoria, you know, Adelaide Terrace, and all of those other places where our state governments live. So that's what I'd be doing.
Fantastic. Tony, do you want to give us your thoughts on that? There's a couple of other questions we'll just close off with, but yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah, I won't give you three things then, Tim, but just one is longevity of policy and testing those policies. That we just too many changes. So they always, you know, we hold up the Fraunhofer Institutes. Well, you know, they were reformed in 1948, and the rules for Fraunhofers haven't changed that much, and everyone knows the rules. Where industry, you know, if you walked out here and talked about trailblazers and things, it's just the latest thing. The SBIR program in the States is, you know, it's a Reagan administration thing, and it really hasn't changed very much. Yes, you review them and you play at the edges and reform them a little bit, but industry takes a long time to learn these programs, and they don't want to engage if they think it's a one-off thing. They absolutely, you know, the fact that we've still got, you know, the last announcement of CRCs is still not on the government website. It's on a political website. The political playing with grant, like the grants belong to one side of politics, is just appalling in my view. They're sitting on a party website right now, but they're not on the government website. Industry hates that sort of stuff because it just gives you the, oh, well, you know, I'm not friends with that minister, so I'm not going to get something, even if it is a fair process. So I think, you know, just a sensible long-term view of we change these things, but let's do a white paper and let's really discuss it beforehand before we make changes and test it from a few angles rather than latest big announcement of his many millions of dollars, because it does take some time to unwind. If you fund these things, they become self-perpetuating. We've had do we have growth centres, or are we going to have growth centres? We're not going to have growth centres, that sort of thing. Government's not really committed to them, but kind of committed to them. They were underfunded initially, all that sort of thing. I think we should have taken a bit more time to think about them and get them right. And if we're going to do it, and then have proper looking at that sort of stuff. So that's enough from me. You don't want 3 if I go on that long.
Awesome, thank you. AJ, there's a question about CQU, which I'm not sure whether you're able to respond to or not, because I know you're not.
CQU.
About CQU. Kudos to CQU and recognition for recognition as a social enterprise. Maybe that's. How does that reflect the university's priority of community benefit above financial benefit in collaborative projects?
Yeah, CQU isn't a Shocker U university, so we've been recognised by the social innovators as being focused in that direction. I think that this kind of harks back to that old misnomer that the only form of commercialisation is bringing money in, and that the only return on investment is dollars. You can be extraordinarily successful at what you do in terms of disseminating and making a real difference in the world, and a difference to the economy even, but not be focused only on, the hard-nosed bottom line to get you into a project. And so, yeah, I don't think that makes CQU any less of a runner in the game of bringing innovative research out to to address whatever problem is out there. I think that should be the end focus of commercialisation. And can I also say, on that point, there was a question from Jane Ryan around thoughts on how we can better incorporate pathways for arts, social sciences and humanities, and pathways for commercialisation. I'm supposing that everyone is familiar with the Stimulating Business Investment in Innovation report that came out not so long ago. And that was kind of at the beginning of COVID. And in that report, Innovation and Science Australia, Andrew Stevens was talking about the ways that we can encourage a more balanced view of commercialisation and bringing in non-R&D innovation into the stable. And this is where Luke's concept of an ecosystem is really crucial, because it's far more inclusive, and it actually it can lead to far better outcomes than just solely a money-focused approach. But non-R&D innovation should be brought into the fold here in terms of the dialogue that we're having. And the HAS faculties have a real role to play, particularly my faculty, business and law. We are all about looking at intra-firm innovation, about adopting and adapting technology to improve a firm's bottom line. So it's not just about cross-sector collaboration, it's also about the kinds of micro innovation that are happening everywhere and was really burgeoning as a result of COVID.
And some of those are not, you might have a contract with a university that's only a few $1,000s and to do a little bit of work. And again, those issues we talked about earlier, if it's a $5,000 contract, you just can't put the effort in. And I agree that really strongly with AJ there, that the science is sort of the 1% inspiration often, but if you're actually going to have innovation, you need that 99% perspiration, and often that's in legal, regulatory, policy, all those things that, you know, technically trained people like me think they're easy, where actually that's the really hard work stuff that you've got to think about. You know, what does society think? What do consumers want? All that sort of stuff. So, and universities can really help. They've got fantastic people, but again, you've got to find them, and you've got to be able to engage with them in a way that is stimulating to them as well. I'm a graduate of, you know, genetically engineered super pigs and virally vectored immunocontraception. Well, they don't. We spend a lot of money, but you don't see them on the list of great Australian innovations. And at some point, they're all stopped by regulation and consumer attitudes that are actually things you can research in their own right, and would have been much more enlightening and a hell of a lot cheaper.
Luke, do you want to close us off with any other thoughts on that particular topic with Haas?
Yeah, look, pathways? I mean, I tried to include reference to humanities and social science, but Jane, thank you so much for your comment, because we can't have major industrial and societal transformation, right? And the rapid transformations that we have without better understanding the societal impact. And, you know, all of those Haas disciplines are central to, you know, unpacking, you know, applying and bedding down change. And, you know, we're always, I mean, even though there is a perception that the ATN, of course, is, you know, STEM orientated, we actually have a wonderful humanities and social science and creative industries. And these are industries of the future, you know, so we have to ensure that those both in the current policy settings, but the future policy settings, there is a broad cross-disciplinary approach. So I'm, you know, I am optimistic that we've had some good signals in policy development in the recent period, and I look forward to even bolder ones in the future, because that's what we need. And let's see what that ecosystem means. AJ, great to hear you support an ecosystem approach. ATN's had our own summit on building an innovation ecosystem. You'll hear more from us about this. And frankly, big thank you to Tim, Stephen, and everyone involved in this session, because it allows us to put some of these interesting things on the table. In a way, we're not in vociferous agreement. I actually kind of like a bit of controversy. So, you know, it's good to have this discussion today. And I'm really confident that we can get things right. Not to say that it's not going to be a hard work and a long process ahead, but let's take that enthusiasm for, you know, what lies ahead for Australia and see what we can get.
And that's a brilliant way to wrap us up. Well, thank you so much, Luke, Tony, and AJ. As you say, Luke, it's actually so enlightening and fascinating when we don't all agree and we can tease out ideas and move forwards. I think it's been a truly fascinating discussion. Thank you so much to all of your time. The conference will continue with a session with Stephen at 1 p.m. looking at the future of pure research. Thank you very much.